But first of all, it's like a real privilege to introduce Imogen, who I haven't seen for a while, who I met when I was working in Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. But Imogen has got a very deep in wildlife CV. She's been working in conservation from the age of 17. She got an environmental science degrees, worked both as a ranger and also as a botanical surveyor. Now is the director for nature's recovery, director of conservation at Dorset Wildlife Trust. She'll correct me. She also shares exactly my hobbies of cycling and trying to grow vegetables. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you, Imogen. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Roger. Lovely to see you again. And yes, my long, complicated job title will come up in a second when I share my screen. But yeah, so I've been in Dorset for getting on for 30 years now, having grown up in the home counties, worked in Berkshire and Surrey, and very much sort of at the forefront of development sort of in those days, especially sort of when I worked for Surrey Wildlife Trust back in the day, and doing botanical surveys of sites which were owned by developers. So, you know, no pressure there. So really got involved in planning as one of my first jobs with Dorset Wildlife Trust. So being at the sort of really front end of responding to our consultations that we get on planning applications, and Dorset Wildlife Trust gets hundreds of consultations a year on applications in Dorset. So I've been asked to sort of introduce really the state of nature, how we are. So I'm not going to talk a huge amount about planning. I'm just really introducing the topic, where we've got to, what do we need to do. So I am just going to share my screen. It will be that one. And there, so you should have it there. Someone, Roger, or someone will shout if you haven't. So yes, there's my job title. I'm one of our two conservation directors, and my title very much focuses on what's called nature-based solutions. And really, in a nutshell, that's about the fact that nature doesn't just exist in isolation, doing its own thing. We'll come back to this as a theme. It very much has a benefit for all sorts of other aspects of our society, whether that be our economic well-being, or our own physical well-being, or other sort of aspects of the environment that nature can really play a strong role in. So that's my job. So really, I thought I'd start with some sort of stock take figures, really, to put it into sort of context of to where we are at globally. And these are some figures, I think they were from WWF a couple of years ago, that there was this huge decline in vertebrate population, and vertebrates are sort of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish. This massive decline since 1970, and if you go back even further, those declines are even higher, largely speaking. Although if you look really back, sort of our loss of woodland really started strongly sort of in the medieval period. A lot of these really strong declines have happened since the Second World War, and particularly since 1970. So humans now account for 36% of our mammal biomass, and domestic livestock the majority of mammal biomass. Wild mammals only 4%. So that's what we're dealing with. And in the area of birds, we have poultry about 3 times as much as wild birds. So human interventions in life have accounted for most of the sort of animals that we're likely to sort of see and encounter out there. And then I think Roger's mentioned already the State of Nature report, which is a coalition of different experts and wildlife organisations coming together over a few years to look at the state of nature. And there's a website. I think the most recent report was 2023, and there is a link at the bottom, which I think these slides are going to be shared afterwards, so that will be something you can click on to get straight to it. And species abundance is declining. So this is, although species are still present in a particular location, the actual physical numbers of that species have gone down. So it's still there. There's still a box ticking that says, yes, present in this square. But actually the number of individuals of that species have gone down hugely. And 16% of species are actually threatened with extinction in Great Britain. So on the sort of assessment as to whether their populations are stable, declining, increasing, threatened, vulnerable, rare, etc., there's 16% that are in those categories. That mean they really are very vulnerable. And we've also seen the distribution changes as well. So about over half of flowering plants have seen their distribution decrease. And I think evidence found recently, it's even shocked me that some of these species, which you do see all the time, but they are now sort of on lists of vulnerable and threatened plants, things that are, say, fairly often encountered in Dorset, like betony, devil's bit scabious, etc. And distributive invertebrates have on average decreased. Some have gone up, but more have gone down than up. And there are particularly stronger declines in some of those insect groups that provide what's called ecosystem functions. So this is back to what is a nature-based solution. So insects that help with pest control, pollination, for example, have shown some really sharp declines. And this was a subject of some work the Wildlife Trust did with others, with some of the academics a few years ago, leading to a campaign called Action for Insects, which you can still find on our website, particularly sort of looking at these functions of insects and how they help support all life out there. So within Dorset, actually no, before I go to Dorset, there is some hope. So here's an example, otters. Otters were almost driven to extinction. They became almost extinct in Dorset and certainly disappeared from large swathes of the UK due to poisoning from DDT pesticides, particularly in the 1960s into 1970s. Those pesticides were banned. This is all related to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, if you remember that seminal work. And they were banned, and gradually otters recovered, but they're an apex predator, so they don't breed quickly, they don't bounce back, and it took a very long time for them to recover, but they are now pretty much everywhere. Other species can recover more quickly. So some of those insects we're talking about, if you actually remove some of the threats and pressures that affect them, they can bounce back quite quickly. So again, some of these more resilient species which you think of as common can make strong recoveries. An example we've seen is our wild woodbury site near Beer Regis, which we acquired through planning processes, something called nutrient neutrality, which our council colleagues might touch on later. And we have seen in 5 years that we've been there, some of the bird species like skylarks and some of the insect species have really bounced back because of the change of habitat, the change of management there. So there are things that people can do quite quickly to help wildlife recover. That, is a very strong message of hope if we make the right changes. So nature in Dorset, I mean, I don't need to really repeat our very special situation in Dorset with its diverse geology. So we have our heathlands in the southeast of the county and in Purbeck. 12% of the remaining area of the UK's lowland heath is in our county. We have a really special responsibility for it. We have populations of all 6 of our reptile species, and I didn't realise when I moved from Surrey to Dorset that actually Dorset was such a stronghold for some of these rarer species. They just didn't occur in these numbers, even though in Surrey there was heathland, but things like the smooth snake and sand lizard, really Dorset is their niche. So we have a huge responsibility for some of these habitats. We also have our chalk downland with our chalk streams, a hugely rare habitat. Again, the UK has a massive responsibility for chalk streams, and they are massively under threat from a whole range of different things, including climate change, changes in nutrient status, abstraction of water, and again we'll touch back on water later with Matt from Wessex Water. We have our coast and our marine environment. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about the marine environment, but again, Dorset is incredibly diverse. Planning system is very different in the marine environment, so we're probably not going to focus on it too much today, but certainly on the edges of it, particularly for our harbours, the planning system has a really important impact. And, not to forget our urban areas, and Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole have got 21% tree canopy cover in the urban area. They have a tree strategy, and very much acknowledging the fact that actually some parts of the urban area are, perhaps retaining more of their wildlife than some rural areas in a different way. I'll come back to that in a later slide, actually. But we are under threat, and work done by Dorset Environmental Records Centre looking at all of the species on their database, all the species that have ever been recorded and those records submitted to the Records Centre. About 1 in 40 are now extinct, as in there have been no recent records whatsoever. This is a higher number than the national figure, obviously, of species threatened with extinction, but because if a species has gone extinct in Dorset, hopefully it hasn't in Devon or Hampshire or somewhere else. But in Dorset, we've seen some huge declines. We've seen new species coming in as well, particularly with climate change. We're at the forefront of species coming across the channel, and I've got some examples on that slide there. Only about 8% of Dorset has the legal protection site of special scientific interest for wildlife, and that figure is in fact much higher in Dorset than it is in some other counties. So we are relatively well off, but 8% is not a huge amount, and we'll touch a bit later on what about the rest. Of the sites we do know about, only about 6% are known to be in good condition where nature is thriving, and so the 30 by 30 target, which I will cover in a little bit more detail in a minute, has somewhat a long way to go. And of course our rivers, as with everywhere, Dorset is about average for that. Less than 15% are in good ecological condition as assessed by the Environment Agency. So talking about this 30 by 30 target, this is actually a UN Global Biodiversity figure that the UK signed up to along with many other nations. It came out of the Montreal Biodiversity Convention, looking for 30% of land and sea managed for nature by 2030. Sorry, I put an extra percent on that. So what does that actually look like? So I've got a few boxes there. That's about 10% of that square covered. As you can see, those squares are all quite isolated from each other. You start to increase and they start to join together. But at 30%, you're almost getting to a stage where you couldn't really add another square without it joining onto another one. And you've got starting to develop some sort of corridors and large chunks of nature-rich habitat, if that's what you've succeeded in doing. And that's really the point. I mean, it still leaves 70% of land for other uses, which we hope would be nature friendly. And it certainly isn't saying that all of that 30% has to be only and solely managed for nature. There are many multiple uses that land can have whilst also being primarily nature rich. So in Dorset, how are we doing on that? This is the totality of Dorset, including Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole area. As I said, 8% site of special scientific interest, which are legally protected. Sites of nature conservation interest are sites which are identified as being of county level for wildlife. They don't have that legal protection, but they do have some policy protection in local plans. There's a few other areas of nature reserve, it doesn't even show up on the map, which are not either of those. And a few other areas of ancient woodland. Again, most of them are either one or the other of those labels. And then some areas that shown brown on my sign, which are ecological networks, and about 9% is within an ecological network shown as being of wildlife value through remote sensing surveys, or because they've been restored through a farm environment scheme or through mineral restoration, for example. And those collectively, those areas of land come to 22% of Dorset, of which, as I say, about 6% is known to be in good condition and managed positively and going in the right direction for nature. But when you look at sort of 22%, that really has that potential to get to the 30 by 30 target, it doesn't look such an impossible target. It does look like, actually, with some tweaks to policy, with some more grant funding perhaps to enable positive management, we might be able to make some progress towards it, along with another 8% from other means and other schemes. Here's a little bit of information that's taken from a document that Dorset Council produced to back up the Dorset Local Nature Strategy, at just what percentage cover all of our bits of Dorset are. So we've got our nature-rich habitats, heathland, unimproved and semi-improved grassland, and broad-leaved and mixed woodlands, as in not coniferous woodland. Those are our, as well as, sorry, coastal and wetland. Those are our most nature-rich habitats, but there is very much nature in some of the other habitats as well, particularly the urban area, as was mentioned, with gardens and tree cover there. And also, obviously, nature-friendly farming within the arable improved grassland. But those areas tend to be the ones where, hopefully, with the right farm schemes, wildlife can permeate through these areas, but they're not going to be the sort of core habitats where nature can really sort of recover from. So what do we need to do to sort of turn the situation around? In my mind, quite simple, really. Stop allowing hostile barriers to wildlife. So that could be sort of hard edges to things, concrete edges, particularly we're talking about sort of, the urban rural sort of fringe area. Stop simplifying the environment. So there's a real tendency to sort of tidy things up, and people just don't like it. And this includes conservationists sometimes, when things are sort of neither one thing or the other. They're sort of halfway between, is it a grassland or is it a hedge? And we do tend to sort of have these hard edges to things, and is, put almost lines around things as this is a grassland, this is a hedge. And actually, if we allow them to sort of bleed into each other, we have much greater capacity for wildlife to sort of connect. And finally, sort of treating nature as an add-on, a sort of nice to have, a luxury. That's great when we get everything else sorted out, as we'll go through today, actually, and certainly in the talk that I'm covering for later, we will talk about some of the wrong thinking around that. And start creating space for nature everywhere. It isn't just about sort of designating sites. It is about aiming for abundance, not just survival. So what are we doing about those plants and animals that just need a little bit of relaxation of some of the pressures on them to really start recovering, and reconnecting everyone with nature. And this is never going to work if we don't involve everyone in it. And it's not just about awareness, it's about active involvement. So that's very much something we're aiming to do. And really, this was sort of illustrated by a report quite a few years ago now by Professor Sir John Lawton, who talked about sort of a number of just basic principles as to what we needed to do to get nature recovering. And those have been embedded in government policy over the years, but have been sort of slightly mangled over time. So I thought I'd just revisit them. So this is more abundance. So these are mayflies, just that ability to see those amazing spectacles of nature that Roger referred to, where just nature is everywhere. And bigger, this is cuckoo, if you didn't know, sadly declining, a very fast declining bird. And really, a lot of the research has shown it's not just about having, good, woodland here, there, or everywhere for them. It's about that connectivity of habitat. Cuckoos do seem to require quite a large area, so places where they still thrive in the UK include, some of our national parks like Exmoor and the New Forest, but sadly very, very declining in Dorset. And I was lucky enough to be in France earlier in the year, and cuckoos were just doing their migration, and there were cuckoos everywhere. Seemingly wherever we went in France, we could hear a cuckoo. I thought maybe it's a really good cuckoo year. And when I come back, in late April, early May to Britain, I will hear cuckoos everywhere, but I just haven't. I've hardly heard any at all. We just need bigger areas of habitat. We also need the existing sites to be better for nature. So this is about our existing precious sites, no matter the fact that they might change with climate change, their exact species composition might change. But actually all the evidence is that the habitats that are brilliant and the most special now will carry on being the most special if they are looked after and looked after properly. So our seahorses here from Studland Bay, they need better management, and that is something that has been put in place with eco moorings and things over recent years. And finally joined, so right through all of the places that we live, and connected hugely with people that live in them. Having wildlife right through our towns, villages and cities is incredibly important. Most people haven't got the time, all the transport, all the resources, or in combination to actually get out in nature all the time. You do need to be, pretty interested in it to get out to some of the most special sites, sadly, although we're trying to make them as accessible as possible. But having nature on your doorstep is hugely important, and having nature connected with other nature sites is important for wildlife recovery as well. So those 4 principles are really what Lawton espoused, and they got incorporated in something called the Environment Act and various other legislation that we've had through the years. So there is some huge amount of positive stuff going on. We've had a number of environmental acts and marine legislation as well. We've got agri-environment schemes that are focused on outcomes for nature, amongst other things. These have been adapted by the UK government since we left the EU, and have brought in some innovative things, such as a scheme called landscape recovery, and that, if it gets into widespread use, will allow huge areas of restoration. There's about 4 schemes in Dorset at the moment that have been proposed, but there is a massive negotiation process with DEFRA. So we shall see if any of these happen. On the minus side, some of the agri-environment schemes still on pause, and government has been rethinking them, just about to start reopening some of those schemes that are most available and most accessible to the majority of farms. So that's been a cause of huge frustration in the farming community for not being able to access those schemes. As Roger mentioned, we have now a land use framework which starts talking about some of these multiple uses and how we might get to this situation where we have more land dedicated for nature, and but at the same time manage to sort of meet our needs in other areas, including farming and food production. We do have some green finance schemes. We're going to touch on biodiversity net gain as one of them later, and I've mentioned nutrient neutrality as well. These are all, they quickly go into the realms of jargon, but essentially the way to think about them is they're providing additional protections and hopefully resources and finances for nature that wouldn't have otherwise been there. They don't sort of allow, in theory, a sort of free pass for development at all. They're additional on top of the existing legislation. So those are all things to be sort of borne in mind when you're talking about them, and when we are, necessarily rightly criticising some of the details of them. And on the other hand, as we'll come back to later this evening, we've got this sort of nature being blamed for holding up development. potential legislation or regulations that are actually harmful for nature, an environment being seen as a political issue when it really shouldn't be, because, as Roger alluded to, everyone likes nature in some shape or form. And again, some of those statistics I will be talking about later when I'm covering for the other talk. So we've seen some local action. I've talked about the landscape recovery already. The local nature recovery strategy has been something that has been dear to some of our hearts for the last couple of years, and I know our council leaders are going to be talking about it later, so I won't go into too much detail, but a lot of nature organisations have been involved in that. And just in Dorset, we do partnership really, really well. So there are a lot of partnerships working not just on landscape recovery, but a whole host of other different nature-based schemes, Dorset Catchment Partnerships, Dorset Local Nature Partnership, things like there's something that's national called the Big Chalk, which is talking about chalk and limestone landscapes. And we're really very comfortable working in partnership to achieve more for nature. There's just so much to do. There's no one organisation who could do it on its own. And there's much more that everyone can do to help, whether that's taking action in your own community, taking action. Our chief exec is fond of saying all you can do is look after your own patch, whether that's your own community wildlife space or your own garden or a friend's garden. Doing something positive for nature. It's great for your mental and physical well-being, as well as obviously helping nature. There are lots of things you can join with, others to do to have a collective impact. I'm bound to say join Dorset Wildlife Trust to find out more about how you can help us, but also telling others. So one of the things that's really going to get momentum is if people understand that everyone values nature. So telling your neighbours, telling your community groups, your councillors and MPs that you actually care about the environment and nature. It just really does have an impact. And I know, talking about some of the campaigns that we've been running recently and writing to MPs, that some of our MPs are saying, my inbox is full about, at one time I think an MP said, well, other than assisted dying, this is the thing that's filling my inbox up. And they really do take notice of it once you've got a volume of people's input that is written in their own words. So it's not sort of spouting what Dorset Wildlife Trust or anyone else tells you to say. It's saying in your own words how you value your local environment, and it's incredibly important, especially in these times when people are trying to play environmental interests off against other interests and imply that they're in conflict where they really shouldn't be. There's a few links there, which, as I say, when the talk is shared, you will be able to click on, and a few of our sources of information. So thank you very much.